The films Not Going Quietly and Takeover are two extraordinary documentaries about the power of resistance and the fight for just and humane healthcare in the United States. The experience of watching these films is exhilarating. If you haven't seen them, you must. And in the context of this moment, where the inequities of our broken healthcare system have been completely laid bare by the pandemic, these beautifully crafted films challenge us to speak out and take action. I'm thrilled to have a chance to talk with the real-life superheroes of Not Going Quietly and Takeover, and to hear them in conversation with each other about the fight for health justice in this country. So I want to welcome Ady, Denise, and Juan. Thank you so much for coming tonight and for joining us in this Zoom. I want to tell you a little bit about the films before we begin, and then also formally introduce Ady, Denise, and Juan. Not Going Quietly is a documentary feature about Ady Barkan, whose life is upended when he's diagnosed with ALS, a neurodegenerative disease. But after a confrontation with the powerful senator goes viral, he's catapulted to national fame and launches a once-in-a-generation political movement. The film is directed by Nicholas Bruckman, produced by Amanda Roddy, executive produced by Bradley Whitford, and Jay and Mark Duplass. The film Takeover is a documentary short. It's about the Young Lords' historic 1970 takeover of Lincoln Hospital in the South Bronx. The film is directed by Emma Francis-Snyder and produced by Tony Gerber. Executive producers are Lynn, Nottage, and Miranda. Not Going Quietly is available to watch on YouTube, on Amazon, on Apple. And you can find out where it's screening on notgoingquietlyfilm.com/watch. Takeover is being streamed right now on the New York Times OpDocs website. These films are riveting. These films are extraordinary. They're masterfully told. They're captivating, and I'm so eager to talk to Denise and Juan and Ady about your experience in the making of the film, but also your views on healthcare and activism and this new generation that are stepping up to the plate. So thanks so much for making the time. I'm a filmmaker, but I came out of activism originally. I was a labor organizer, and I turned that activism into filmmaking initially, doing a lot of work with Michael Moore over the years. So I watched your films with both an activist lens and also a film making lens, and just honored to have this conversation with the three of you. So thank you. Denise Oliver-Velez was formerly a professor of anthropology and women's studies at SUNY New Paltz and a contributing editor for the progressive political blog Daily Kos. She's been a political activist and community organizer, was in the civil rights movement, the women's movement, AIDS activism movement, and a member of both the Young Lords Party and the Black Panther Party in the late 60s and early 70s. She worked in community media and public broadcasting for many years and was a co-founder and program director of Pacifica's first minority-controlled radio station, WPFW-FM in Washington, D.C. She was the executive director of the Black Filmmaker Foundation. Denise, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Juan González has been a professional journalist for more than 30 years and was a staff columnist at the New York Daily News from 1987 to 2016. He has hosted Democracy Now! For over 25 years. He's a two-time recipient of the George Polk Award for Commentary, 1998 and 2010, and was inducted into the Deadline Club New York Journalism Hall of Fame in 2015. He's a professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers and a founder and past president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. He was a founding member of the Young Lords Party in the 70s and the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights in the 80s, and has received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, the National Council of La Raza, and the National Puerto Rican Coalition. He's the author of 5 books, the most recent of which is Reclaiming Gotham, Bill de Blasio, and the Movement to End America's Tale of Two Cities. Thank you, Juan, for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
And Ady Barkan is an organizer and campaigner who Politico called the most powerful activist in America. Over his career, Ady has specialized in bringing policymakers face-to-face with the people whose lives their decisions shape, and generating public attention and political pressure out of those confrontations. Since 2017, Ady's work has focused on healthcare, marshaling his own paralysis from ALS to urge Americans to demand more of our government. He received his Juris Doctorate from Yale Law School and now lives in Santa Barbara, California, where he works as the founder and co-executive director of Be a Hero. His story is told in the new documentary, Not Going Quietly. Denise, I'd like to start with you. And, you know, this film, Takeover, it's a documentary short about the Young Lords' historic takeover of Lincoln Hospital in the South Bronx. And it's riveting. You know, the story is extraordinarily riveting, and your voice is one of the voices that carries us through it. And, you know, it's not only speaks to the moment in the 70s and the fight for access to healthcare, but it speaks to this moment today. And so I wanted to, you leave us at the end of the film with this idea that the young activists are going to take over, and you're handing the baton to them. And I wanted, you know, to talk to you a little bit about that, since you know that you leave us with that. You're trying to inspire a generation of new activists. Was there any one person or group of people who inspired your activism to begin with?
Oh, actually, the list is too long for me to name my personal sheroes and heroes because they span a spectrum. I grew up in a political household, so my parents had to suffer through the repression of the McCarthy period. They had to leave New York and we moved to the South. And as a kid, I was then confronted with Jim Crow. So I have folk singers that we were surrounded by, people like Paul Robeson, women that inspired me like Shirley Chisholm or Barbara Jordan, or I mean the list is a very long one, but the thing that I think was key is that for us, politics was a family affair. We were very rooted in our history. So I was raised knowing about the people in my family who were enslaved. And since for me, having had a great grandmother who was a midwife, who could not read or write, but she never lost a child, I was raised knowing about sterilization. She used to bake all of the cloths in the oven. She made people scrub up at a time when this wasn't practiced. And it gave me a sense that in many ways we got disassociated from good medicine and were put into the hands of a corrupt system. And many of the things that Black folks learned in the home that was passed down from generations, they became disconnected from when health care, and I call it unwell care, in these butcher shops that were set up for poor people, for people of color in our system. We have built into our system bad health and a dual system. If you're wealthy, it's not a problem. And so for me, it goes even beyond just the politics of health. It goes into the structure of our system, which is inequitable for so many of us.
The South Bronx was one of the poorest congressional districts in the United States. Every health indicator was high, and for the young lords, health was always a priority.
One of the things that begins to develop in our community is a high incidence of tuberculosis, and we began to see it as an epidemic.
The way the TB testing works, the young lords would go out every Saturday. A couple of days later, you had to go check. So if it was positive, then you needed to get an x-ray to confirm whether or not you actually had TB. So of course we didn't have an x-ray machine.
The city had this huge TB truck, an X-ray mobile TB truck.
But where they assigned the TB testing truck to go was an affluent area where probably no one had TB.
What we then decided to do was we were going to take over the truck. So the truck parks. We took over the truck. We put the 2 technicians in the back of the truck. I was in the cabin of the truck. Now, mind you, the technicians, they initially were very scared. I mean, this was a takeover. They were being kidnapped, basically, for all practical purposes. Once we got to the place and they saw the number of people lined up, they just stayed there all day. They gave great statements to the press. The technicians said that they had never x-rayed as many people as they had that day.
By nightfall, when people stopped coming, the police came and took the truck. But we'd already made the point that there was a tuberculosis problem the city was not addressing.
Juan, do you want to speak to your early heroes and sheroes that inspired your activism?
There were a few. I would say principally my father, who died when I was very young. I was 16 at the time when he died, and he wasn't an activist as we would know it, of someone who went out on his own to organize folks, but he was a kitchen worker and a restaurant worker in New York City from the time he came up from World War II, and my family moved to the United States from Puerto Rico, and he was always a member of the Hotel Workers Union, Local 144. And I constantly always remember my father would never miss a union meeting. And I didn't quite understand at the time why he felt it was so important to attend these meetings and be active in the union. And he was actually much more politically aware than I realized. But of course, when he passed away, when he was just 39 years old from cancer, I think that part of what drew me to health in the Young Lords, and as you probably know, I was the Minister of Education and Health for a while. So the health ministry was part of what I was in charge of in the Lords, was the actual illness and death of my own father, who died of cancer, but who died of cancer because of a terrible doctor and a botched operation at no other place than Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, one of the most famous cancer centers in America, cancer hospitals in America. And because of the terrible treatment that his doctor gave him, by the time they brought him into the emergency room and operated on him, it was too late. So he died the day after on the operating table. It always made me understand from the very beginning. I felt that there had been malpractice, but my family at the time was so poor, and we were so little educated about the health system that we didn't even think of suing. We just accepted the fact that this had happened. And so I think that's always been a motivator for me to try to assure just and equitable treatment by the healthcare system to the poorest of Americans.
Juan, I'm sorry to hear that about your father. Ady, I was interested to learn that you were an activist long before your healthcare activism. So can you speak to that question of what inspired you and your activism originally?
First, I just wanted to say thank you for hosting this panel. It's an honor to be with you, and alongside Juan and Denise. I was so moved by your film, Takeover, and so moved by the deep organizing that you did through the Young Lords. I fear that we don't do that kind of organizing anymore, and we are going to need to relearn those skills and rekindle those practices if we are going to save our democracy from the fascists, and save our planet from destruction. To your question, yes, my activism has certainly been inspired by freedom fighters past and present. I agree with Denise. The list is long, but I didn't grow up in an activist household. But, in my lifetime, I was particularly moved by the Occupy Wall Street movement a decade ago. I was living in New York at the time, and spent a lot of evenings that fall at Zuccotti Park, listening to people shed light on the dysfunction of our political system. The fact that the 1% have too much wealth, corporations too much political power, and elected officials too little accountability to the public. I've spent my life since then trying to rekindle the spirit of Occupy, and make real its vision for a more just and equitable democracy. Chairman McGovern and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I am 35 years old and I live in Santa Barbara, California with my brilliant wife Rachel and our beautiful toddler Carl.
Who's that?
Every month since my diagnosis, my motor neurons have died out, my muscles have disintegrated, and I have become increasingly paralyzed. I am speaking to you through this computer because my diaphragm and tongue are simply not up to the task. Although my story is tragic, it is not unique. In many ways, it is not so rare. Every family is eventually confronted with serious illness or accidents. On the day we are born and on the day we die, and on so many days in between, all of us need medical care. And yet in this country, the wealthiest in the history of human civilization, we do not have an effective or fair or rational system for delivering that care. Our time on this earth is the most precious resource we have. A Medicare for all system will mean more time giving high-quality care. And for patients and our families, it will mean more time doing the things we love, together. And so my closing message is not for the members of this committee. It is for the American people. Join us in this struggle. Be a hero for your family, your communities, your country. Come give your passion and your energy and your precious time to this movement. It is a battle worth winning. For my son Carl, for your children, and for our children's children. This is our Congress. This is our democracy. And this is our future for the making.
You know, you spoke beautifully about the impact Takeover had on you. I'm curious, Juan and Denise, can you speak about, you know, your viewing of Not Going Quietly and how you watched that film, what your reactions were to that, anything you want to say about Ady's activism that's chronicled in this beautiful film?
I watched it twice, and Ady, I have to say to you, when the kids did Power to the People, I was going right on in the film, and that really brought a smile to my face because you're passing things on to a younger generation, and that's how we keep things going. So you're not only an inspiration to us old folks, because I be old these days, but you're inspiring little ones. And that's the only way we're going to survive, is if we pass it on. So you becoming a power of example is very, very important. And the fact that you have set up things for heroes, I would say sheroes too, is key. And that's the kind of commitment. For me, activism is committing one's entire being, one's life, and you have done that. And thank you for your life.
I also want to echo Denise's thoughts. When I watched the film, I was really captivated by the enormous sacrifice of basically at a time when one is most vulnerable in a profound illness, to be able to open yourself up that way to the public and your family and your struggles and everything from getting dressed to sitting in a doctor's office and getting a prognosis. And I thought it was really amazing and extremely brave to do that. Not too many people would want to share, and at the time when they're going through so much turmoil, be willing to share their innermost problems. And I think that, but clearly you understood, Ady, that this was the way to galvanize people to make the issue of healthcare real. And so I was really blown away by that, the intimacy of the film, as well as the message that it provided.
Thank you both. That is so generous, especially coming from you.
My whole body is going paralyzed, but losing my voice is far more consequential for me than losing my ability to walk. I've got a lot to say and not a lot of time left to say it in.
What is Abba doing?
Hey, Carl.
Medicine.
Yeah, medicine.
Whoa.
I'm not sure how many more months I have where I can speak well enough that I can be understood, but I plan to spend every one of those months doing everything I can. As my life is coming to the end, I want to make my son proud.
You know, all of you have put your lives and your freedoms on the line to fight injustice, you know, broadly and specifically, you know, around healthcare. It's powerful. It's very powerful. I wonder, you know, if you feel that the battle for universal health care and the issues around health equity, you know, they've clearly changed since the 70s. I wonder if the core issues in your mind have changed. And, you know, your film ends with this very sobering note about, you know, the impact of COVID-19 on the Black and Latinx communities in New York City in particular. And you know, we know and we've seen that COVID has exposed, you know, the inadequate health systems, the coverage, structural inequalities, and those are the underlying plague in this country. And so I'm wondering, you know, if you can kind of speak about how the pandemic has, you know, informed your thinking about the healthcare struggle now in your communities in New York, in the country, and in the world.
Yeah, if I can say, first of all, I think that when you say our film, we were the actors in the film. It was Emma's film. She's the one who put it all in context. But I would say that, you know, one of the things I say in the film is that healthcare is a bigger problem today than it was then. And I don't think that people really understand how true that is. You know, in the Lords, we spend a lot of time dealing with the diseases of poverty, you know, and so there was a lot of attention to lead poisoning and tuberculosis detection and so forth. But the issue of the health of the American people has never been greater, even though we're supposedly one of the wealthiest countries in the world. The chronic conditions that the American people face today, whether it's diabetes, obesity, addiction to drugs. We spent a lot of time dealing with heroin, the heroin epidemic in the early 1970s in the United States. Do you know that in 1970, 7,200 people died in the entire country from drug overdoses? That's at the height of the heroin epidemic. In 1988, at the height of the crack epidemic, 8,800 people died of drug overdoses in the entire country. In 2020, 93,000 Americans died of overdoses, 10 times the number of people in 1 year than died at the height of the crack epidemic or at the height of the heroin epidemic. Now, the population of the country has doubled, but drug overdoses have increased tenfold. we have an enormous health problem in this country that is not being dealt with. Whether it's the suicide rate that's twice the rate that it was when we were active in the Young Lords, and so the health care system, despite all the money it spends, is not producing a healthier population. Not to mention the fact that people are living longer, so therefore the elderly will need much more care, or do need right now much more care, because we have a bigger elderly population. So there's an enormous crisis in healthcare today, far greater than the one that we were dealing with back in 1969 and 1970, 73. And even though all this money and all these advances have been made in medicine. So I think that is a testament to the amount of work that we have before us. I can talk about why we've had so much trouble, but I guess we'll leave that till later in the conversation.
I agree with Juan. I also would add to that the power and control and corruption of the corporate interests, meaning the pharmaceutical industry, has also grown. And add into that the fact that many of us who came from homes traditionally where food got cooked, whether it was rice and beans or cornbread and grits, and now almost everything is a chemical. And I didn't grow up on junk food, And so again, you bring in the pharmaceutical industry, the food industry, and so on and so forth. So we didn't have a sense when we were in the Lords, we didn't really talk about that we didn't have a term environmental justice, and food deserts, those are things we're beginning to look at today. And all of this is part and parcel of what is health. And we are an unhealthy society. And so you can't just address, Lincoln Hospital is bad, take it over. Things were a lot simpler to kind of focus on that kind of element, or, test the kids in East Harlem for lead and get the landlords, make them take the paint off. It is complex and it's difficult to fight. I mean, we're in the struggle for our lives at this point in time. And for future lives, if they're going to be 3 or 4 more generations, and if we keep going the way we're going, it ain't gonna be that way.
And you speak about corporate power and the power of pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies, and this is though a country that we tend to blame individuals for systemic problems, and particularly around healthcare. So I'm curious, I guess, with Ady, given that we live in a country where, individuals are blamed for the structural problems, how hard was it for you personally to speak out and share your story and your journey?
That's a really interesting question, and to be honest, no. I felt fear about my diagnosis, and it was certainly scary to share it with my friends, family, and broader community just because of how horrific of a disease ALS is. But I didn't feel fear or shame in challenging my insurance company that denied me a ventilator that I needed to survive, for example. The profiteering and cruelty of our current healthcare system is brazen, and I have no issue calling it out. In fact, I feel I have an obligation to speak out.
And when he speaks about the brazen nature, the greed of the system, I think it's important for people to understand that the healthcare industry is the largest industry in America, right? It employs more people than any other industry. Right? It represents about almost 20% of the entire gross domestic product of the United States. In other words, there's a lot of money in health, right? There's a lot of money in treating people once they're sick. There's not a whole lot of money in preventing people from getting sick. and in developing a society where people stay healthy. But there's a lot of money to treat them once they are sick. And I think that your average heart surgery in the United States is $250,000 to $400,000. Every patient walks in the door with potential heart surgery. There's dollar signs for any hospital that takes them in. Hospitals fight over who gets the biggest share of the cancer patients, or the hospital, or the heart, or the surgeries, or the transplants. It's an enormously predatory system, the way it's developed here in the United States. And unfortunately, we still haven't developed the understanding among the masses of people to demand a complete overhaul of this system. There is a growing population that senses that, but unfortunately not the organized force yet that can insist on a complete overturn of the current system.
I was a third-year resident at Lincoln in July of 1970. I was on call, maybe went to sleep at 2 or 3 in the morning, and I heard this commotion outside. Wasn't sure what it was.
My job was to go into the administrator's office and to ask the administrators to leave. We have been asking for these changes to take place here in the South Bronx at Lincoln Hospital for over a year, and you've paid no attention to us, and you've called the cops on us, so now we're putting you out. We've taken over the hospital. We're gonna run it. You're out. I will walk you to your car.
We made it clear that there was a new administration. And to accentuate who we were, we put a Puerto Rican flag, a giant Puerto Rican flag outside the hospital.
Had a sign that said Lincoln Hospital, the People's Hospital.
I went to the window and looked outside, and I turned around to my friend Fitz, and I said, "Wake up, the revolution is here."
The vast majority of people in this country do believe that it's government's responsibility to provide health coverage for all. Roughly a third of people say no, it's not the government's, responsibility. But, we live in a democracy. And 67% of the American public think that there is an obligation. So do you have a sense of, why that majority hasn't prevailed? And is it the corporate power behind, the healthcare giants that are keeping us back?
I think we make sense of these numbers by understanding the outsized power of special interests and big money in our politics. Insurance, pharmaceutical, and hospital corporations specifically have co-opted our democracy, halting urgent and popular action like universal health care. Another example can be found in prescription drugs, which are made exorbitantly expensive by pharmaceutical companies. 90% of voters want the government to do more to deliver lower drug prices, yet Big Pharma halts reform at every turn because it may cut into their profits. Not to mention people are going bankrupt or cutting their pills in half because they can't afford the costs. We don't use this word enough in the domestic context, but this is corruption of the highest order.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to add that there are other issues that a lot of times make people very uncomfortable talking about them. There was in the 1619 project, there was an interesting piece called "Why Doesn't the United States Have Universal Health Care?" The answer has everything to do with race. It was by Janine Interlandi. And if you go back and look at who gets health care and who doesn't get health care and the history of that. If you look at countries with universal health care, which tend to be homogenous, that doesn't mean that they don't have a class system, but they certainly don't have structural racism built in. And I'm looking at it right now with also colonialism, because, for example, you can get Social Security, SSI here in the United States. If you're Puerto Rican, if you move back to the island, you lose your benefits. Doesn't make any difference what disability you have. And we're beginning to fight about those inequities, even between, we're screwed up here on the mainland, but you're even worse off in the colony. So you begin to have to look at layers of things: corporate greed, racism. Then there's built into the system what happens to women and misogyny. Look at what we just saw happen in the Supreme Court. They're trying to throw out Roe. I have problems because the Hyde Amendment has prevented women who are in lower income bracket from even accessing things that other women could get. And the politics of it is, don't talk about Hyde, because who does Hyde affect? Women of color. So all of those things, I mean, we have a mishigash here that's, we have to mobilize more people, and we've got to just keep putting the word out. But it is complicated. There's no magic wand to wave here.
And Denise, who do you see, in addition to Ady, who do you see doing that hard work of mobilizing? Who what gives you hope?
I'm looking at the work of people whose names you may not even recognize. Some of the women that are in Mississippi out there trying to deliver services to people in the community, and they don't have a high profile and they don't have a lot of money. And essentially because like Lori Roberts, who's in Mississippi, who is on top of trying to deal with access to reproductive health care. She is also disabled herself. And people don't think about the grassroots groups that we have to reach out to and ensure that they can even sustain keeping their doors open. We throw away, and even poorer folks throw away a lot of money on bullshit in this country. And we have to also change the way that we think about funding, organizing, and mobilizing people. I think that was one of the things I had some young person say, so what kind of grants did foundations were funding you in the Young Lords and the Panthers? And I was like, that was not happening. We did an awful lot with very little. Because we utilized our community resources and collective action and sharing and pooling of money. And that's key too, because organizing, people have to eat. People have to have a roof over their heads. And not enough people are willing to dig into their pocket. I'm poor. I live on a fixed income. I have no pension. But I can always find a few nickels or dimes to rub together to give to somebody else. And I think that it's about a kind of sensibility that we have to implant in people that goes beyond just the kind of political rhetoric that we're used to dealing with. And what Ady said about going back to some of the face-to-face, on the ground, organizing, knocking on doors. You can't make a revolution on Twitter, okay? It ain't gonna happen. or on Facebook or Instagram, TikTok or whatever. And I'm not knocking that they exist because I'm on Twitter a lot. But organizing is day in, day out. It isn't glamorous. And I think that that's one of the things that I feel I would say to young people today, that you're going to have to get out there and knock on doors and sit with people. There's a photograph of Juan on the subway talking to an older person, and he's got the newspaper out and he's explaining some of those issues face to face on the subway. It's one of my favorite Young Lord photos, Juan. But that's the kind of basic work that people have to be committed to do.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I would also add that, Tia, in response to the question you initially started this round with about why is it that such a large majority of people favor a government-supplied healthcare, but we don't get it, is that we don't really live in a democracy. We live in a republic of representative government. The majority only gets to speak once a year. The rest of the year, the representatives are the ones who speak, and they're easily bought and paid for. And that's the problem, I think, that Ady has referred to, the ability of the pharmaceutical industry and the physicians and the hospitals and all the other parts of the healthcare industry to buy off the elected representatives. So that we need to be able to not only organize, because unfortunately, the progressive and radical movement goes through phases. Sometimes it gets very involved in electoral politics, other times it rejects it completely. Neither one of those, I think, are the proper approach. You can't ignore electoral politics, but you can't put all your eggs in that basket because the elected officials inevitably disappoint you. They always do. And then, of course, once they get into positions of power and influence, then there's a sector of the progressive movement that immediately declares them sellouts when the reality is that they're within a confined condition. So that what you need to do is not only organize and participate in electoral politics, but always be prepared to disrupt. You've got to be able to disrupt the system. And I think what Ady said earlier on, when he was so influenced by Occupy, right? In the Young Lords, we always occupied institutions, right? What we did not expect that we were going to transform those institutions by occupying them. But we understood that unless you disrupt business as usual, continue to be conducted that way. So every once in a while, you've got to disrupt and force a change, not through the electoral process, not even through just organizing and getting people to participate in a protest, but to say, no, this is not going to function this way. You're going to have to deal differently. And and the other thing about an occupation, and since Ady was at Zuccotti Park, he understands there is no more liberating thing you can do in your lifetime than occupy an institution and create new rules. And once you have successfully done that, you realize the potential that people have to change a society. You won't succeed at the first occupation or the second or the third, but eventually, as more and more people understand the enormous potential that they have to change society, once they seize power from those who have it at that moment, I think that lesson stays with people throughout their lives. And as we say, and as I've often said in the Young Lords, we always sought to liberate Puerto Rico. We weren't successful. We haven't been successful yet. But in the process of all these occupations that we did, whether it was Lincoln Hospital or the People's Church or the tuberculosis truck, we liberated our minds. And we said, hey, we can do anything. We have the potential to do anything if we get enough people together. And I think that's the most revolutionary thing you can do, is to liberate your mind. And that takes you much further and then electing another official to another post so they can disappoint you once again.
I love that, Juan. And let's remember that the occupations of the auto plants built the American middle class.
That's right.
I would like to say that I think that we have to be very careful when we, and I'm going to agree and slightly disagree with Juan, we have to be very careful that in pushing for activism, which is the thing to do, and I think you can take over just about everything at least once a week. But we also, I'm watching the erosion, and one of my sheroes is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm watching the erosion of our voting rights. And I'm looking at thank you, Jesus, for Sonia Sotomayor, who I listened to the other day. And she was amazing, but she's in the minority on that Supreme Court. We must understand that we live under a system of laws and legislatures and whatever that can pass the bills, but we're not going to get anything passed if we don't put people in office. So it's always, for me, a two-pronged approach. Back in the day, out in Oakland, California, it was the Black Panther Party, a lot of sisters in the party who went around and knocked on doors and got Ron Dellums elected, Democratic Socialists in Congress. So we have to be, because I have talked to young people who have said, well, I'm not going to vote for anybody, whatever. And now they're screaming bloody murder because of certain things that are not happening and certain things that are being taken away from us. So the work that people like Stacey Abrams and whatever are doing in Georgia, across the board, I encourage people to get involved with their local school boards, because now you've got all of this madness going on with, critical race theory and oh my God, and let's erase. We fought to get Black studies, Puerto Rican studies, Chicano studies, and whatever. And now they want to eliminate all. They don't want to teach history. They don't want to teach women's history. So there's a balance there. We have to be careful about how we deliver that message, because I've sat down with some young folks who told me, well, I'm never going to deal with all politicians. Screw them. And I'm like, no. People died to get some of them folks in office. Now we can hold them accountable, and we should always open our mouths and understand that the political structure is not going to make that change by itself. It requires that countervailing activism, but don't walk away from. But my mother would come back from the dead and kick my butt if I decided I wasn't going to vote, because my family fought. My family had to arm themselves to be able to vote. And so I was raised with those lessons too. Okay.
We're here in Washington, D.C., trying to stop this bill. Why? I have ALS, which is causing me to become paralyzed quite quickly. And as a result, I'm using a wheelchair. My voice is no longer as melodious as it used to be. To Senator Jeff Flake, you don't have to do this way. I understand that you want a tax cut. I understand that you are conservative and I am not, and that's okay. But you can get a tax cut without ripping health care away from tens of millions of people.
This is Ady Barkan.
Hi, how are you?
How are you?
My name's Ady. So can I ask, as you know, this bill is going to cut Medicare and destabilize the entire national health insurance system.
Sure. He's still in the process of reviewing it. He hasn't made a conclusive decision one way or the other. So We're grateful for you guys stopping by, though.
Well, so let me tell him this. Hey, we are human beings. We have dreams and hopes and love and relationships just like he does and just like you do. Yes. And message number 2 is, if he votes for this bill, he will lose his job in 10 months. So that's his choice.
It's interesting because Ady, shows us the power of, of individual action, inspiring collective action. I think through Takeover and the Young Lords, action, we see the immense power of this collective action. I think the two films are really in dialogue with each other because you need both, right? And I think, Ady, what I see you doing in this film is you're using the media, you're using social media, not, to create a revolution, to do exactly what I think Juan is saying, is sort of help people liberate themselves, to challenge them to take action. I mean, were you aware, Ady, actually of what happened at Lincoln Hospital, before you saw this film, and the history of that, of the Young Lords movement around healthcare?
I love Takeover, and I've been encouraging everyone around me to watch the film. I am so grateful to all those who played a part in the history of that day, and for those who brought this story to life. Especially because the movement for healthcare justice in America spans decades, it's surprising to me that we as a society don't talk enough about the People's Hospital. My key takeaway from the film is that civil disobedience is one of the most effective and necessary tools to bring about transformative change. As activists, we often utilize other tactics first in order to make our voices heard, but sometimes the only way we can make our demands heard is by engaging in acts of civil disobedience. Transformative change in this country has always been driven by agitators outside of government, clamoring for reform. Especially when so many lives are at stake, sometimes you have no choice but to disrupt and obstruct, to get arrested, to place yourself in the line of fire in order to get what you need.
Not only was there print journalism and television, but also the police. This was an invasion of city property. It was quite a threat, and of course, it's illegal. So it got hot, as you would say.
The police came with everything they had. It was unreal.
We had a press conference announcing that we had taken over the hospital, that we had demands.
Community worker control of the hospital, higher wage for the workers at the hospital, preventative health programs.
A very important demand was the provision of childcare. Daycare is key to the involvement of women.
And we announced that we were not leaving until the city made a firm commitment to build a new hospital.
Timothy Snyder, who's a historian of fascism, says that actually insecurity is actually the aim of these leaders, that they don't want us to feel secure, that it's not just that they're profiting, off of us, but that they actually, really want to keep us unhealthy, keep us insecure, because that's very conservatizing. And I just want to offer that up and see what you guys think about that.
Well, I would say not just in the healthcare system, but as a longtime journalist, now actually for more than 40 years, that's the business model of the media. The mass media want people to feel insecure, because the more insecure they feel, the more their eyeballs will gravitate to the news, whether it's the lead story being a hurricane about to heading your way may destroy the entire East Coast. It's always a sense of, if you can create uncertainty and insecurity in the masses of people, they will follow what you say, and they will. And I think that that's part of how you keep people down. And I think that and I've seen it over and over again in media coverage of events. The more you can create conflict, the more you can create insecurity, the more that people will gravitate to what you have to say. And I think it's part of, I guess, a progressive and revolutionary approach, is that you want to point to the structural problems in the society, but you want to find ways to unite people, to have them find their common ground, their common interests, and not what divides them or what makes them fearful of one another. So I think that that's certainly true in the healthcare industry. The more they have people afraid of what illness they're going to get or what new drug they could use. I mean, if you watch television these days, I still watch a few hours a night of television, of the news or sports, and the amount of ads about all kinds of medicines that are being peddled, and the side effects of the medicines that they list at the very end.
Yeah, it scares me to death. Who wants to take that stuff?
But the cure of the medicine is what they're constantly peddling to people for, whether it's restless leg syndrome or this ailment or that ailment. It's just talk to your doctor about this new drug.
And Juan, I'm curious, after the takeover at Lincoln Hospital, were the young lords embraced by the community? Were you, because you guys were in the vanguard here, and you were doing something, and you were, risking your lives, your personal safety. How did the greater community respond to this action?
I think there was a lot of support for our work. I think we made mistakes along the way, and I think one of the big mistakes we made was, once we started to get reforms in some of these institutions, I think Denise was alluding to this, we didn't also at the same time seek to exercise more control over them. So for instance, Lincoln Hospital, a new Lincoln Hospital was built. And also as a result of our pressure, the federal government eventually adopted these reforms calling for public hospitals to have community advisory boards that would basically monitor the operations of these hospitals. This is another reform that came about as a result of our activism. But then we didn't get involved in those community advisory boards. As a result, more conservative Puerto Rican politicians in the South Bronx, people like Oliver-Velez, a notorious poverty pimp, moved into the vacuum. They grabbed control of these community advisory boards. They used them for patronage for their own people. And so they, in essence, they seized some of the benefits of the new power relations that we had created as a result of our activism. We were a little bit too infantile and too naive not to think that when you win a victory, you've got to also then pursue it and figure out a way to continue to build on it. And so we moved on to other things. And so I think that was one of the mistakes that we made.
I want to point out, though, that the average age of people in the Young Lords was 17. Okay. And we had members who were 12. Well, 2 that were 12. So I agree with Juan. We in some ways, our politics that we were reading from various sources around the world and whatever, we were making up stuff as we went along, and there wasn't always follow through, that's hard too. And on top of that, 2/3 of the organization split and went to Puerto Rico, and which leaving the base where people in the community loved us and embraced us. And I'm talking about old folks, young folks. And that also created a lack of, there was not continuity. And the other thing is that when you quit your job and became a young lord, and you were a young lord 24 hours a day, you also have a burnout factor as well. A lot of times young folks are not good at pacing themselves in the struggle and accepting, well, the revolution, we're going to make it in the next 5 years. The idea of a continuum of long slog is not always embraced when you're 17 or 18 or 19. And I can look back on it now, that I'm 74, but there is a lot to be said for having these kind of conversations, intergenerational conversations, sometimes for those of us who can look back and look at where we failed. And I don't want to beat up on the failures, but at least to begin to hindsight is often 20/20 and 40/40, and we can look back and see where that didn't carry through. And that takeover of not only those community boards for the hospital, but community boards for the schools and whatever, because we didn't have time for that. And we need to learn how to figure out where we're going to fit into every cubbyhole in the structure that we can burrow our way into. And instead of saying, oh no, that's, some, bullshit, whatever. So that's key. And one of the things that I've noticed, even though I'm retired now, but I was starting to notice when I was teaching at New Paltz, my freshman students, they have stopped teaching civics to kids. They don't get it in high school. They don't get it. I never had a freshman student who could explain to me, that Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law. They didn't know any of that. They didn't understand how their town government worked. They didn't understand. And we are missing, and that's just one area, because I could talk about all kinds of other areas. We are allowing our kids to be miseducated. I wish in some ways we could institute what they call Saturday schools, where you go into the community and bring kids together and have your little Saturday schools to make up for what is not being taught in the public school system. And now it's going to get worse as you have the reactionary forces that are out bludgeoning people, threatening people on school boards. I worry about the young generations coming up. How are we teaching our kids and our grandkids? Ady talked about Occupy. I make you a bet that there's not a kid who sits in a classroom who gets taught about the Occupy movement. I know they don't get taught about the Young Lords. I know they don't get taught about the Panthers and the American Indian movement. They don't get taught about the Revolutionary Union movements. In fact, they don't even get taught about unions. So again, we have a lot of work to do. You're not going to be able to educate people about why we need universal health care or anything else if you don't have a vehicle to be able to do that education. We need to think about the 5-year-olds and the 7-year-olds and the 9-year-olds and the 10-year-olds, and because they're going to be those future warriors. And if they're not learning this stuff, where are they going to get it from? Who's going to give them that education? Are they going to get it at PS 111? I don't think so. So we have to come up with alternatives, thinking toward the future. We did it with young people because we had, what do we call it, Juan? you were Minister of Education.
Yeah,
Community.
our own political education classes, right. Everybody
And
had to
we-
go to PE. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to see a copy of Takeover in every high school in New York City. How can we make that happen? You know, because you can't go to every high school, you know, personally yourselves, but,
Right.
you know, this film can be that vehicle. And I'd say the same is true with Not Going Quietly. You know, this film, you know, speaks volumes, you know, and it should be in every school in the country.
I agree.
And that's the exciting thing about, you know, about film, and what, you know, is that it can be leveraged, you know, by educators, by community organizers, you know, by folks that are trying to raise money or raise awareness.
Susan needs to call his friend Eric Adams and get it in the schools.
I heard recently that Takeover is being shown to in a webinar to the nurses union, and of course one of our former lords, Minerva Soya, has been organizing nurses for years, and before that with the 1199 union. So we should begin to think of, when the weather is better, utilize some outdoor screening things in neighborhoods, because we actually used to do that. Shut down the street and show film up against the wall in the community. And we can go beyond the institution of the school system and figure out ways to bring things directly into communities and hook up with community organizations. And I think, from my perspective as a former educator, I know that my students did a lot better with visual materials. I used a lot of film in my classes. Unfortunately, we're moving into a world where people don't want to read as much, but that's okay. Film is powerful, video is powerful, and you're right that we should begin to think about the way to get more of it out there.
I think a very important segment is the young people coming into the healthcare industry, because you need community pressure, but the real lasting change occurs from the workers within any particular industry, if they can begin to demand change. And I know recently, for instance, I'm out here in New Brunswick at the main Rutgers campus. I live right near the campus, and where, you know, there's a big medical school here, Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Robert Wood Johnson Barnabas Health is the largest healthcare system in the state of New Jersey. But they developed last year a very important group of medical students called White Coats for Black Lives. And very sort of radical group, and they became very involved with us in the community here as we fought university and hospital expansion into the Latino community here of New Brunswick. And they got really captivated by Takeover, and then it helped propel them to take even more militant actions within the medical school. They actually launched a whole petition campaign against the medical school's involvement in this gentrification of the downtown area of New Brunswick. So I think there's a lot to be done, because, for instance, at Robert Wood Johnson Hospital here, this is a nonprofit hospital. You know, all these hospitals are supposedly nonprofit, right? Well, when I checked their financial report, they had 14 people in their executive leadership, each making over $1 million a year, including one person making $5 million a year. We're not talking about doctors now, we're talking about administrators. You know, how the hell does a nonprofit hospital whose mission is to serve the community end up paying multi-million-dollar salaries to all of these executives? You know, especially since they pay no taxes. You know, this nonprofit business is a great business in America. If you haven't learned how much money you can make in nonprofits, and nonprofit hospitals are right there along with the for-profit hospitals as milking the system. But these medical students are beginning to become aware of how they're being used, and I think they're going to have long-term impact on affecting real reform within their institutions.
Unfortunately, the way our system works, the disposable folks are a lot of people who are frontline healthcare workers and home care workers. And I'm looking at stigma again, once again, being thrown at people from South and Central America, from Haiti, who are the backbone of home care, health care, elder care, and whatever, and least appreciated workers in many ways in America, and just like daycare employees as well. So there are certain things that we need to uplift. I've watched this during COVID, and my husband, who had a stroke, but before his stroke was working with formerly unhoused folks in a shelter, case managing. And these are all friends of mine that are home care attendants. I'm looking at stigma that they're faced with, and they are taking incredible risks, and they're underappreciated. And it's something we've seen since all the way back in the time of the Young Lords. We talked about a lot of that because a lot of the people that we were organizing with from Health Revolutionary Unity Movement and Think Lincoln were the workers in the hospital. And I'm glad you brought that up, Juan, about what's going on over in Jersey. Unfortunately, the people who are probably the most important in this society get the least amount of credit, get the least amount of funding, get the least amount of anything. And, you know, the pigs of the world are fat cats. And that's something that we have to begin to engender in young folks, a level of respect for the people that, you know, like I said, that flush your toilets, clean your floors, and take care of us when we're ill. It is so important. So
thank you so
I
much for
will
raising
stop
that.
at that.
No, thank you for raising that, Denise. It actually helps to segue to a question I have for Ady. You know, very prominent in the film were a number of caregivers that you employed. I wondered if that has helped, that experience with these home caregivers prompted you to engage in this new campaign around support for patients and their families.
Simply put, I'm alive because of home care. But because home care is prohibitively expensive, this option is not available to most others who need it. Right now, there are nearly 1 million people across the country sitting on waiting lists for Medicaid's home and community-based services, hoping to get the care they need to survive. Where home care is not available, patients are forced into dangerous institutions like nursing homes. During the pandemic, over 140,000 disabled Americans died from the coronavirus in nursing homes. Home care is quite literally a matter of life and death, but as for what else it provides me, home care makes it possible for me to live a safe and independent life at home, surrounded by my wife and 2 young children. It also allows me to continue the work of pursuing health justice in America. Home care saved my marriage, allowing my wife and I to become partners and co-parents again, instead of patient and caregiver. Real, quality support means providing care that allows folks to live with dignity, and that includes the freedom to live where we want, and the day-to-day support to lead an independent and meaningful life.
I got to see Carl there in the picture as he, how are Carl and Willow doing?
They're great.
I want to give you guys each an opportunity, if you would like, to just say one more thing, if you have the time or the inspiration, to speak to the next generation of progressive activists. What do you hope they take away from your story? What do you want them to know as they carry the fight forward?
I only have one thing to say. Activism is not rhetoric. And unfortunately, too often we have academicized political struggle and activism, and you end up losing your ability to communicate directly with the community. My dad used to say to me, if your grandmother doesn't understand what you're talking about, you failed. And we have gotten to the point where, in many ways, political discourse becomes an elite segment of the community, and it's not down to earth. So, learn to talk to folk, and not talk at them and not talk down on them. And that's hard, because when you're young, you try to absorb a whole bunch of things, and all of a sudden you start talking like the deconstruction of the paradigm shift. You know what I mean? And that doesn't cut it with folks. So I'm like, break it down, keep it simple, stupid, and get to work.
I would just say, I think the key thing is to, as Denise said, it's a long struggle. You've got to keep at it. We have to always guard against, at the time when a movement is rising, as it was, for instance, last year with the massive upsurge, is the time when people have to guard against arrogance, guard against feeling that you know everything, because in my experience over the last 50 plus years now of mass struggle, all movements end up receding at times, or being crushed, or a combination of crushed and co-opted. There's a lot of co-optation going on now by universities and foundations and everyone else who wants to fund movements for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what all of those are really are attempts to buy off the most active voices of the resistance movements. So you've got to be careful, not be arrogant, and always seek to talk to those who disagree with you, not to condemn them. And hopefully you can win them over, or they can win you over to a better perspective.
Words to live by.
What I
Thank
found
you.
in these last few years of advocacy is that there's great meaning to be found in the movement for justice. I realized that through collective struggle, I could find personal liberation. I could transcend my dying body by hitching my future to yours. I don't think those things are just for me. That purpose, that opportunity to give back, those are things available to everyone who strives to guarantee human dignity for all people. I hope that's what those who watch my documentary take away from it. And I hope they get involved as a result. I don't think they'll regret it.
I think they'll be very moved by all of your stories and by all the films, by both the films. I want to thank you each so much for taking this time to have this conversation together. As I said, I really think these two films that you're in really speak to each other. These struggles, are ongoing. They didn't start today, and they won't end tomorrow. But with your, I think with your examples, you've given us a lot, and I hope I hope the films reach audiences really far and wide. These films will inspire change. So thank you so much. Laura, is there anything?
My best to Denise and to Ady.
My best to Ady, Juan, and Tia. Thank you so much for having us.
You guys are my heroes and sheroes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for all that you do.
Be well, comrades.
Much love to you, Ady.